Hi, Scott from Digital Fish with part 2 of stick baiting. In my first video I covered fishing gear, rod, reel, line, leader and other items. Today I'm going to be talking about the sweep and retrieve and also a bit about stick baits themselves. This is probably the most important part of stick baiting. If you can learn how to swim a lure really well and enticingly, you'll get strikes, and that's the number one thing. So it doesn't matter if you've got a super expensive lure, if you don't know how to swim it, you're not going to get strikes. So investing some time and effort into learning how to swim a lure properly is really important, and it will pay off. The textbook retrieve is a sweep of the rod, and basically you start and pull the lure under the water, the nose dives under, and then it swims, it moves side to side, it might flip, and when it does that it gives off flashes and it can help attract predators. And then you come to the end of your sweep and you pause and the lure pops out of the water and it bobs. Don't be in too much of a hurry to pull it again. That bobbing is quite important. If you've ever seen wounded bait fish before, sometimes they just sit there gasping on the surface, and this is when kingfish can sometimes strike. So don't be in too much of a hurry. It can be really hard when you've got a big kingfish behind your lure not to want to go super fast and trying to get it to strike. Okay, focus on working the lure properly. Sometimes you need ice in your veins to stay cool, but focus on swimming the bait because that will get the strike. So you've cast the lure out, point the rod tip at the lure, make sure the line is fairly tight. So if it's windy, you may have to wind in a bit of line so that the lure is fairly tight, the rod tip is pointing at the lure. You sweep the rod back and you should see the lure go under, it'll swim and then it'll pop up again. You then retrieve the line, pointing the rod tip towards the lure, and you sweep again. Keep watching the lure. This is really important because you'll start to see fish appear behind it. You might see a swirl, you might see a tail out of the water, but if you know the fish is there, you can start focusing on really working the lure really enticingly to get a strike. Sometimes there'll be a pack of kingfish behind your lure. You can tell your mate to also cast, or if you don't want him to catch a kingfish, don't tell him at all until you're hooked up. It's quite important when you're first starting out to experiment with your retrieve. You can sweep the rod. You can also use the reel a little bit as you sweep the rod as well. Sometimes I'll retrieve a little bit and at the same time pull the rod to help get the lure under, and then it starts to swim. You can use a combo of the rod and the reel, and it depends on the lure. Some lures swim differently from others. Smaller lures may need less effort to pull it under the water, and so just be mindful of this, and you need to experiment and watch the lure and see what it does when you pull the rod, when you wind and pull, or a combination of those two different things, until you can see it going under, moving, swimming, popping back up. It's not uncommon to have a kingfish or even a pack of kingfish behind your lure and they're not striking. So if the normal sweep and retrieve doesn't work, this is my number one tip for trying to get them to strike. Instead of your usual long sweep, give it a quick jerk. Move the lure about this far, 30 centimeters, but make sure that you jerk the lure under the water and that it really splashes and makes a commotion. And you can do that once, pause, twice, pause, 3 times, pause, and see if you get a reaction from that. This has been my number one way of getting kingfish to strike lures that don't normally respond to the normal sweep. So it does work. So another little tip here, if you don't have a lot of space to be able to sweep the rod, sometimes quick little jerks can actually work instead, so it's worth trying. Okay, so here's a few more tips on catching kingfish on stick baits. If you're out fishing and you can see a school working on the surface and you go over to cast to them, try and position the boat so that you can just reach the fish with your cast. Sometimes if you get too close to the boat, they get a bit more suspicious. I've found that sometimes if I can just reach the fish with my cast, they tend to bite a bit more freely and a bit more aggressively. So another tip here, when you're out fishing, and if you find that when you swim your lure, when you bring it in, it's got the line around the middle hook like this, it can be super frustrating, especially as it inhibits the action of the lure. A couple of tips here to stop that. First one is, when you go to cast, watch the lure, and just before it hits the water, put your hand on the line gently, and that means the line will straighten out and it won't go around the hook when it lands, because sometimes when it lands, the line can be around the hook. The other thing you can do is, when you're fishing the lure, make sure you don't pull it too hard that it skips and spins or turns end over end on top of the water. There can often be a time when that middle hook catches on the line, and you don't want that to happen when you've got a big kingfish behind your lure. That is, you will be very frustrated. So another thought here on experimentation. If the kingfish aren't hitting your lure, try different stuff. Try a slightly faster retrieve, maybe try a slower retrieve, try the jerk method that I mentioned before. Maybe even try casting out, skipping it quickly across the surface, and then just do your basic sweep and retrieve. Maybe that will trigger that response, but don't be afraid to experiment, especially if the fish aren't hitting your lure. Try mixing up your retrieve. If that doesn't work, then maybe try changing lures. If that doesn't work, maybe even try changing your leader, but sometimes the fish just aren't in the mood, so it can be a bit frustrating. But try those things and hopefully one of them will work. Just a couple of thoughts around choosing a stick bait. If I'm out and it's dusk or dawn, or maybe it's an overcast day, I generally like to maybe try a brighter lure and work that. Unless I know what the kingfish are feeding on, then I'll swap to that sort of pattern. If it's a really bright day and I don't know what the fish are feeding on, then I'll try using a more natural coloured stick bait instead and working that. If you're catching fish and, for example, you know there's a decent school and there's some big fish in there but they're not hitting the lure, maybe go up a size. Sometimes kingfish, then the bigger ones, like a big lump of protein, and so that's maybe what will trigger them to smash your lure instead. So one of the things you may come across when you're casting are wind knots. Wind knots are bunched up knots in your line, usually within the first 10, maybe 15, 20 meters of your braid, and you go to cast it out, and within a second or so of casting, you'll feel the line sort of tangle and then keep moving out. Sometimes it may even stop on your guides. Super frustrating sometimes, especially since braid can snap very easily and it may weaken your line. So why is that? Well, here's a couple of tips you can try to maybe reduce wind knots. The first one is don't overfill your spool. I know it's really tempting when you buy expensive braid and you want to get the whole lot onto your reel, but if you overfill it, that can cause wind knots and you're going to lose it anyway. So you might as well make sure it's not overfilled. So the other reason that you may be getting wind knots is actually the way you cast. I found I get more wind knots if I go to cast and I snap it forward really quickly at the end of the cast, and obviously my left hand is pulling down the rod butt really quickly. That may cause more wind knots. If you cast with a smoother action, that can sometimes make the difference between getting a wind knot and not getting a wind knot. The other reason you might be getting wind knots is just the combination of the gear that you've got, the brand of braid and the configuration or length of the rod, and maybe the weight of the lure as well. They all contribute to causing wind knots in your line. So what you can do is just check the first guide. If you have K guides on your stickbait rod, so that's a that's a K guide there because it looks like a K. You can't use this trick, but before K guides came out, they used to reverse the first guide, and that would actually help funnel the line through and prevent wind knots. If you have those kinds of guides and the first one isn't reversed, then you can get a rod builder to reverse it, and maybe the second one as well, and that can reduce wind knots. So in part one of stick baiting for kingfish, I recommended not using trebles, but instead using single inline hooks. Just something to really note here is that some lures are designed to swim with trebles. So tip here, if it's not swimming particularly well, maybe go up a hook size and use heavier split rings to equal the same weight that a treble may have on the lure, and that may help it swim a bit better. At the end of the day, don't forget to wash down your lures as well as your rod and your reel, obviously with fresh water. The hooks and the split rings can rust, and if you throw them in the bag and don't use them for months, then you get them out again and they're corroded, then it's not very good. And hooks and split rings, the good quality ones, pretty expensive. So wash them down in fresh water, dry them off, and spray just maybe even a bit of inox on them as well, or inox on a cloth, and rub them over the split ring and the hooks, and that'll keep them corrosion free and also nice and sharp as well. So if you look after your gear will look after you. So there's part two of how to stick bait for kingfish. In part one I covered the gear. In my next video, in part three, I'll be covering where to find kingfish and some tips on handling. Thanks for watching, and I hope this helps you get onto some good fish.